As Brian said, I am visiting here from Ottawa, Canada, and it is a pleasure to be here, with the exception of watching our women's hockey team lose to the US last night. So congratulations, Team USA. So back in the day, we learned how our websites worked, and we kind of debugged things by using the view source feature in our browsers. And we'd see code look like this, including inline fonts. I think I see a marquee tag in there, all sorts of things. And that was how we learned how to code. We found sites we liked, we viewed source, we ripped them apart, copied them, and that's how we kind of learned HTML. And then more recently than that, when we started developing with code on the server side, we'd use var dump or echo to output variables and try and debug when things weren't working correctly. Until someday, someone came along and taught us XDEBUG. And we had breakpoints in our server code, and we could watch variables and do all sorts of fancy things that made our lives a lot easier without having to continuously refresh in the browser and upload files that had temporary debug code in them. But now, we're working with websites that have a lot of the code, if not all of their code, running in the browser itself. There isn't server-side code running, so XDEBUG wouldn't be an option. So what do we do now? Enter Chrome's developer tools, which when they first came out seemed like the poor stepchild to Firebug at the time. I was reminded of this drinking dinner last night. But now Chrome DevTools have a whole pile of really powerful features in them, and new features being added fairly regularly by the team over at Google. So I thought it would be worth showing you how some of these work. You can access the DevTools in 3 ways if you're not familiar with them. One is by going into the developer menu under More Tool and choosing Developer Tools. The other is right-clicking on your page on any element and clicking on the Inspect option. And the third is by typing Command-Option-I on a Mac or Control-Shift-I on a PC. Those are 3 ways to get into the DevTools window. The part of DevTools that you're probably most familiar with is the console. This allows you to view warnings and error messages thrown by your pages and interact with the DOM from the command line. Now, I've had a bit of a reputation at WordCamps of taking the dangerous route and ditching out of my slides and doing a live demo for the rest of the talk. Because what could possibly go wrong? Why would this be any other exception? So let's go to live demo. So here I am in my browser, and I have a little demo page set up that has already output some information to the console. So I'm going to open DevTools, click on the console tab. Can everyone see that okay? Let me see, can I? A little bit better, there we go. So console.log is a command that I was very familiar with. I used it all the time. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I learned there was other things that the console object was able to do. You can also output errors. You can output warnings, or you can output information. And they're all shown in different colors in the console output. You can also output debug messages, which by default are not shown in the console. If you go into the levels menu here, you can turn on verbose mode, which will also include now your new debug line. So you can escalate the type of error message that you're putting out to the console. You will notice here I have 5 of this as a warning. And DevTools has collapsed those. I can open that up. All it shows me is the line where that error was thrown. It doesn't show me the individual 5 errors. If we go into the gear icon here for console settings and click on Show Timestamps, those 5 errors now get expanded out so you can see the timestamps of when they run. I'll turn that back off. You can also turn on in console the view of logging XML HTTP requests. and hiding network warnings if you don't want to show those, or network traffic. So this would show, for example, network errors will show in the console your 404 errors. The XML HTTP request will show the results of your AJAX calls. So those are handy to have. Now, have you ever tried doing a console output of an array? It's kind of interesting what happens. So right here I have an array of names. And if we bring that up in the console, you get a display like this that you can start expanding, seeing the values. That's kind of neat. What I recently found out is you can do a console.table. We'll refresh. It outputs that array in tabular form. Much easier to read. And if you do want, right below, you do have the original output as well. So we have this group of messages that we wrote out to the console. Let's say this was all related to a process that we were running in our app, and especially if we're debugging and there's a lot of data that we're outputting to the console, a set of messages that are related. We can group those together. What we can do is take our list of messages and do a console.group. We can name the group, output types, we'll call it. And at the bottom, we will do console.groupEnd. Now when we go back and refresh, output types is a header shown above those messages that we can collapse. So cleans up the amount of data that shows up in your console, makes it a bit easier to browse through. You can also do a group collapsed so that when you refresh, it starts collapsed by default. And then you can open up that group if you need to see what's in there. The other thing that you can do with the console is run a timer. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to write a debug statement saying start timer. I'm going to use console.time, and you name the timer because you can have multiple timers running at the same time. I'm just going to run through a for loop just to waste time, and then I'll run a console.timeEnd specifying the same timer name, and the amount of time it took to run that timer will be output to the console. So we'll just refresh. We'll wait. And that timer took 1,493 milliseconds to run. So you can use that to start monitoring some performance of different routines in your JavaScript. So that's some of the great stuff that's in there about the console. The other one I did want to point out is an option back in the gear menu again, preserve log. So how often have you seen a console message appear right before your page disappears as you're navigating away from it? If you turn on preserve log and you navigate from page to page to page, or you start refreshing again, the console log stays in place. It just keeps appending to the bottom of it so you can see the messages output throughout the navigation of your site. So that is console. Next thing I want to look at is the Elements tab. So we're going to call this up again. We're going to look at Elements. And this tab in the DevTools allows you to interact with your DOM. You can modify it. You can put breakpoints on it. You can modify your CSS and all sorts of other fun stuff we're going to look at. So here we have a page. Nice thing is, remember I said there was 3 ways of opening the DevTools. If you open it by right-clicking on an element and clicking Inspect, it will drop right to that point in your code. So it's now, I right-clicked on the button, and I've gotten right to that button in the element. I can go and modify, for example, the show alert I'll put in there, and if you look at my page, the button now says Show Alert. So you can quickly make modifications to your page and see what they're going to look like right from the DevTools window. We can also put breakpoints on an element. So we'll take our body element here, and I say I want to break it when any attribute is modified on the body element. So now what happens, we're going to go over, and I just have a button here that runs a little JavaScript code that just changes the background color of the body. If I click on that, all of a sudden it triggers that breakpoint. So breakpoints aren't only on the JavaScript code itself, but also on the DOM. And you'll notice on the right-hand side here, there is a DOM breakpoint on the body element for attribute modified. I'll just run that, and there, it is changed. We can also then, what do I want to show in here? We can modify our CSS. So if we go back into Elements, I'm going to go back to that button, and we can change let's change the padding on the button. Make more padding. So there we go, the buttons have more padding around them. So you can test those changes before you go into your CSS and work on them. Very common thing I look at is colors. You'll see here, first of all, if you're not familiar with this, at the bottom, we have a button with a background color of green. It has a strike through on it. This means that there is a CSS rule that has negated that one, and if we look up higher, we see on this one, the background color is blue, and that's the one on line 20 of our live demo CSS that is actually active. When you're modifying colors in the DevTools, if you click on the color, it pops up this little color palette. If you click on this little window here, you have a color palettes window that comes up. You can set your own custom color palette, let's say to use your corporate colors, so that it's always available in your browser to set those ones with. The other really useful thing is to hold down Shift and click on the color. It'll switch from saying blue to giving you your RGB codes, your codes in HSL, and in hex. So you can alternate between the different formats of looking at those colors, which is very useful if you're having to switch over to another app and enter those color codes somewhere rather than having to use a converter. Event listeners are incredibly useful. So there again, we're going to look at a button. I'm going to go to the Event Listeners tab up here. And I can see that there is an event listener on the click event. If I expand that out, it's listening on the selector for button.button alert on live demo.js line number 3. So if we click there, it immediately takes me into my JavaScript code right to the code that's going to run if I click on that button. So it's a fast way of finding the code that is associated with an element. If we go back to the elements view again, there's another menu for accessibility. So I'm still looking at a button here. We can see that its role is a button. It has no additional ARIA information, and its contents are show alert. It has no title attribute. So this starts to give you the information that is important when accessible technology is interacting with this button. And important to note that we are using a button tag, so the role is button. This is important to use semantic markup, of course, if you're coding for accessibility and not creating a div that has an on-click on it or something like that, because one of the things that we're missing is that role would not be button. The browser or the assistive technology would not interact with it in the same way. If we look at our links here at the bottom, next demo and console examples, as I hover over them, I have the font going bigger and bolder and in red. In the Elements tab, I can click on a link, and I can say, force its state to be hovered. Click on that, and now that one link is now in hover state permanently while I'm looking at it. To turn it off, you go back to force state, and you uncheck that element. And so yeah, that is kind of the main stuff that is in the elements box. Under source, this is where you get into being able to view all of the JavaScript that you are running in the background of your code, as well as your HTML. So one handy thing you can do here, Command P opens up a dialog where you can search by file name. So if I want livedemo.js, I can jump to it that way, rather than going through the tree and trying to find that file. Especially working in WordPress and you're going into WP content, plugins, your plugin name, your assets folder, it's much easier just to do a find file. You can also do a option command F, and I want to look for something that references my button alert. It's a full search of the source code right inside DevTools. So then I say, oh yeah, there's the click event I wanted. Click on it, and it brings me to that piece of the code. Again, that shortcut on a Mac is Option Command F. One of the really, really cool things I've been playing with lately is something that Chrome is calling workspaces. And if you go into this File System tab, there's an option to add a folder to a workspace. So I'm taking my live demo folder, so right now, the site that we're looking at is running on a local by Flywheel server. So I am calling it actually on a web server, not locally on my file system. But I'm gonna go and find those files on my hard drive, give it permission, and it has now linked all of the code that it's seeing in the browser to the code that's in the file system. So if I go and say, hello, Shawn, and save the changes, if I show that alert, it says, hello, Shawn. If I go into my code in my IDE, guess what? It's also saved my local file. So the changes that I was making to CSS and to JavaScript are now saved back to the file system rather than me having to go, yeah, that worked, now I'm going to go make those changes. You can have it save them right away. Of course, the other thing you can do in the Sources tab is take any of your files and create breakpoints on them. So I'm doing a breakpoint here on, I'll do it on that alert box again. If I click on that, we get a breakpoint. So this was when I was talking earlier about the way we learned XDEBUG. This is the equivalent of being able to debug your front-end code. And at this point, I'm stopped. I can look at anything in the DOM. I can inspect variables and stuff before I tell it to continue on and run the code. If you're trying to find elements on your page, there are shortcuts as well in the console. So just like using jQuery, the $, and I can say I want to look at my buttons. That returns an object with the 4 buttons that are on that page. You can also do the $, and it's doing the same thing. One of those, I think, was supposed to return the first instance of it, and the other one returns all of them. So I'm not sure what was running. It could be because I have jQuery running and it's taking that over. Because the $ and $, are native to Chrome DevTools, regardless of whether jQuery is running. The network tab is where I've been spending a lot of my time, especially since starting to use the WordPress REST API, because it's going to show you all of the calls that are being made through Ajax, as well as the calls that are being made on your initial page load. So if we look in the network tab, we're seeing we have the HTML page itself being loaded, the CSS, JavaScript. Oh, we have a broken image here. So we're seeing that there was a 404 returned. So we can go and fix that. We're also seeing the waterfall diagram. So if I look at my image of the coffee cup, we're seeing that it was queued for 1.23 milliseconds, then stalled for a bit. The really important thing here is we weren't seeing any data coming through until 19 milliseconds in. So if we were dealing with a web page where that time to first byte was really long, we know that's something that is blocking our page from loading quickly, and we'd want to try and reduce that value. So you do get the waterfall information there. You can restrict what's being shown in the network tab by choosing content types. So if you wanted just images, you could click on image. Just JavaScript, same thing. I always leave, when I'm working, this disable cache button on. As long as Chrome Developer Tools is open, Chrome will not be caching anything on my page. So I'm not accidentally getting an old CSS file, an old image, anything like that. So it's nice to leave that enabled. Just like in the console, Network has preserve log as well. So as you're navigating from page to page, all of the network output stays there, which is really good when you're debugging stuff as you navigate away and you want to see what errors came up. Clicking on an item in the network tab gives you all sorts of additional details. You want to look at the headers, so you can see what I requested. You can see the HTTP status code that came back, the remote IP address, as well as all the response headers that came back from the server with that request, all the request headers that went out. So it allows you to really start debugging what's going wrong, especially when you're making AJAX calls. So I have a button here. We'll click. It says Get Posts via REST API. This is making a call to the default posts endpoint. And it's just returning the post ID and the post titles that I have in my WordPress install. If we look back in Chrome DevTools, we see at the very bottom now a call to that posts endpoint, and the JSON data that it returned is available, so we can start debugging that. One of the things I've come across a lot when working with REST APIs, especially with post endpoints, as you're developing, you'll end up with something where you make your REST API call, and it's going to return a 500 error because you were missing some piece of code in your REST API endpoint. Well, rather than going and filling out a form again that's going to submit to that API, if I just want to test that if I run the same thing again, is it going to work? If you right-click on that call in the Networks tab, you can say replay XHR, and it will take all of the same data, including any post data, and just run it again. And so I've done that. I've just sat there and kept running things until I've got it working, which is much better than filling out maybe a complex form or something to trigger the AJAX call. When you're working with images, so here we have a call that was made to our coffee.png with this nice looking coffee. You're yawning up there. I think you could use a coffee. If you right-click on the image, you have the option to copy this as a data URI. So that will automatically convert that image into, why is it freezing? I'll just paste it. It's a large image, I think, which is, yeah, there it is. So there's all the data URI code. So you could put this now into your CSS file as an image and have it produce that image. I would not do that with a full-size coffee image like that. Maybe just an espresso shot instead. It might be better. So yeah, copy to data URI is kind of awesome. We have device mode. So up here in the top corner, we can click on device mode. If we go back into the browser, it's now emulating what this page would look like on a mobile device. And we can pick from a set of preset mobile devices, or we can create our own profiles as well. And so it shows you what that page would look like at the different resolutions. You can also switch this online mode to different tiers of speed. So you can see how fast the page would load on a very slow connection versus on a fast LTE connection or something. Under the network tab, you can do the same thing directly without going into the device emulator. You can, even on your desktop view, give it what speeds you want to be able to run at. And when you create a network profile, you're specifying upload and download speeds in kilobytes per second, as well as latency. So you can really start to get an idea of how your super fancy, high content website will look like on a slow connection. It's good to be able to test against that. And a couple of little things I wanted to show. Under application, so I'm going to do this again, but off the LoopConf website. So under the application tab, really handy thing here is cookies. You can go in and manage your cookies. So you click on the domain name. You can see the 2 cookies that are being set on the LoopConf website. I could also choose to add a new cookie right away. So that's set. Or I can choose to delete a cookie, and then I could go refresh the page. Let's say that cookie was my logged into WordPress cookie, and it would automatically have me logged out. Right-clicking on the domain name, you can hit clear, and it will get rid of all the cookies on that domain. Next thing I want to show. So here I have a page that is just checking if I'm running IE, and it's going to give me a warning if I am. Pardon me? Exactly. So what we're going to do is go into this tab here. There's a More Tools menu. And once you start digging in here, you'll find there is all sorts of stuff. But one of the things that it has is the option for, where is it? Which one is it? I think it's in this one. Yes, it is. It has user agent picking. So you can turn off select automatically. I'm going to tell it I'm using IE10. And if I refresh this page, now the error comes up saying, you appear to be using Internet Explorer. So I'm on a Mac. I don't have IE. I don't want to spin up a VM. So just quickly testing to see, is it going to check for it? Not actually how will the page look, but does it recognize it properly? You can do right in DevTools. You can also, I'm going to use this page here. There's a sensors menu that you can use. So I can tell it that my computer is a mobile device that is in landscape mode. And when I refresh, now it says your device orientation is working, and it will give me rotation data if it's available from that device. So you can test your mobile rotation, the accelerometer, and all of that from right in DevTools. You can also do geolocation overriding. So if I go back to my demo here and say, where am I? I have an alert box coming up. I think I have a breakpoint that's running here. No, I broke that, apparently. Anyway, what that would do is it overrides the lat and long that your browser returns as where your current location is. So you can test how your page would render if accessed from Australia or from Europe without actually having to either be in those locations or enable a VPN that would make it look like you're in those locations. You can just tell the browser, return this information instead. Finally, one of the ones I use is in the render menu. You can emulate CSS media. So if you want in your browser window to see what your page would look like when you're doing a print layout, and what I've done in my CSS is my navigation menu at the bottom. I made it disappear in print mode. So if I go back to screen, you'll see those 2 nav buttons. If we go into print, those nav buttons disappear. So it's a quick way of working then with your page in that alternate view. The other thing that is built in is auditing. And what this does, this is a built-in version of Lighthouse, Google's auditing tool. So it can do audits on progressive web apps, performance, best practices, and some accessibility checks. So for example, on my page, it's going to tell me that one of my images is missing an alt tag. Things like that are now built right into Chrome without having to use a third-party accessibility tester. And with that, it appears we have run out of time. So I hope I've given you a couple tips and tricks, things you didn't know that were in Chrome DevTools that will make your life as a developer easier. Thank you very much.